Good evening. We interrupt regular programming to bring you this breaking news update.
Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to hear is not just another political update. This is the moment the entire country needs to stop, look up, and finally pay attention to the real forces shaping their lives, because behind the headlines, behind the cheering crowds, and behind the so-called victory celebrations, something far more consequential has just happened. A single political win has exposed the true architecture of power in America, how decisions are made, who benefits, and who gets left behind. This wasn't just a gamble that paid off, it was a calculated strike by the very institutions that have mastered the art of turning political drama into economic advantage. For years, we've been trained to follow the noise today, we follow the money, and suddenly every piece of the puzzle snaps into place. This is the power shift everyone felt coming but couldn't yet name. And now, you're going to understand the full magnitude of it. Buckle in, because once you see the mechanics of this system, you'll never look at American politics the same way again. Power shift exposed. Political victory signals deepening corporate influence over policy market. Elites mobilize how strategic alliances turned a political gamble into economic leverage. The recent political shift, widely characterized as a bold gamble, that ultimately delivered a major win, has exposed a deeper dynamic operating beneath the visible surface of electoral theatrics. While commentators focus on personalities, conflicts, and tactical maneuvers, the more consequential development is the accelerated consolidation of influence by corporate and financial elites over the machinery of public policy. The political victory is not an isolated event. It is the product of long-standing structural conditions in which economic power continuously shapes, redirects, and ultimately determines political outcomes. At its core, the first keynote underscores a critical reality. Political institutions do not operate in a vacuum. They function within an economic system where corporate interests possess disproportionate access to lawmakers, regulatory agencies, and the messaging apparatus capable of manufacturing public consent. This latest shift in political momentum reflects the culmination of years of strategic positioning by business interests seeking favorable policy landscapes. These interests understand that the most effective way to secure long-term profit expansion is to ensure predictable, pliable, and business-first governance, regardless of fluctuations in public opinion. The political win signals a renewed period in which deregulation, tax restructuring, and reduced public sector oversight become the dominant priorities. These shifts rarely appear explicitly in campaign messaging. Instead, they manifest through legislative proposals crafted by industry, aligned think tanks, donor networks, and advisory boards. Whether the rhetoric is framed as economic freedom, growth incentives, or removing bureaucratic barriers, the substance remains consistent. Policy recalibrated to benefit capital accumulation over social investment. In the second keynote, the mobilization of market elites becomes central to understanding why the gamble succeeded. Political gambits only pay off when they align with the interests of powerful economic groups capable of supplying the resources needed to overcome institutional resistance. Corporate actors, major investors, and financial institutions saw an opportunity in the political strategy, an opportunity not simply to back a winner, but to shape the definition of winning itself. Their support created a feedback loop in which political messaging, economic forecasts, and media narratives collectively reinforced the idea that this trajectory represented stability, growth, and inevitability. Such alliances are not spontaneous. They are meticulously developed through networks of lobbyists, political action committees, legal teams, and policy strategists. When a political figure signals openness to deregulation, corporate tax relief, or the weakening of labor safeguards, financial elites do not merely applaud, they invest. They provide the media amplification, donor coordination, advisory expertise, and institutional legitimacy necessary to elevate the political actor while marginalizing dissenting viewpoints that challenge concentrated economic power. The gamble paid off because it tapped into structural grievances that have accumulated for decades. Widespread economic insecurity, marked by stagnant wages, precarious employment, and rising costs of living, creates fertile ground for political narratives that redirect frustration. Instead of scrutinizing the systemic role of corporations in job offshoring, wage suppression, or healthcare profiteering, Public anger is often rerouted toward cultural or partisan antagonists. Market elites benefit from this redirection because it prevents the formation of broad-based economic solidarity that could challenge their dominance. The political victory thus serves a dual purpose. On one hand, it provides the appearance of democratic expression, a signal that voters have chosen a particular direction. On the other, it functions as a mechanism through which economic elites secure the policy environment most conducive to maximizing returns. These two processes operate simultaneously but unevenly. The democratic component is highly visible, while the economic component remains largely obscured behind closed-door negotiations and technocratic language. The deepening influence of corporate interests can be observed in the immediate reactions of financial markets. When major political winds favor the interests of capital, markets often surge, not because of any tangible shift in economic fundamentals, but because investors anticipate friendlier policy conditions. Regulatory agencies may face pressure to scale back oversight. Labor departments might deprioritize enforcement. Environmental protections could be diluted as industry groups argue that such measures hinder growth. Each of these changes transfers power away from the public sphere and toward private capital holders. However, the story does not end with policy. The broader economic landscape is shaped by the expectations these victories generate. Corporations may expand lobbying efforts, confident that political leadership is aligned with their priorities. Wealthy donors may increase funding to ensure the continuity of favorable governance. Think tanks and policy institutes may publish aggressive proposals advocating further rollbacks of public regulations. The victory becomes not a single event, but a foundation upon which long-term economic strategies are built. The second keynote involves the calculated mobilization of market elites, which reveals another critical aspect of the political gamble, risk mitigation. From the outside, the gamble appears daring or unpredictable, but from the perspective of corporate strategists, it is a carefully hedged investment. By diversifying support across multiple candidates, influencing media narratives, and maintaining control over policy drafting infrastructure, economic elites ensure that whichever political actor emerges victorious remains anchored to their interests. This reduces uncertainty and guarantees continuity. The mobilization also affects public perception. When prominent financial figures, corporate CEOs, and influential business associations publicly signal confidence in a political direction, it shapes how voters interpret the stakes of an election. It frames the winning strategy as economically rational, business-friendly, and growth-oriented, even when the benefits are disproportionately concentrated at the top. This framing, reinforced by media echo chambers, cultivates an environment where alternative economic visions struggle to gain traction. What emerges from the combination of these two keynotes is an understanding that political victories cannot be detached from the economic forces that underwrite them. The gamble paid off because it never operated solely in the political sphere. It was embedded in a larger economic architecture engineered to protect and expand the interests of those who control capital. The deepening corporate influence over policy decisions reflects not simply the outcomes of elections, but the structural arrangement of the U.S. economy itself. Regulatory retreat ahead, major wind sparks, renewed push for deregulation and capital expansion labor on alert. New power realignment threatens worker protections and collective bargaining. The latest political shift has triggered an immediate and coordinated movement among corporate actors and policy architects to fast-track a regulatory retreat that had been steadily advancing beneath the radar. The victory has emboldened deregulation advocates who now see a clear runway to accelerate their agenda, framed publicly as economic revitalization, but privately structured to expand capital's domain across multiple sectors. This recalibration of policy direction reflects a strategic alignment in which political momentum becomes the mechanism through which corporate interests transform long-sought wish lists into actionable, legislative, and administrative change. Industry coalitions, financial institutions, and large-scale investors have already begun signaling that the new environment presents opportunities to loosen oversight, weaken enforcement, and reshape the regulatory landscape to their benefit. The renewed push for deregulation is grounded in a familiar logic. Regulation is recast as inefficiency, oversight becomes obstruction, and public safeguards are portrayed as burdens that stifle innovation. This narrative propagated across media channels and think tank reports, creates a veneer of economic rationality that masks the material consequences for public welfare. The political victory essentially serves as validation for these narratives, giving policymakers aligned with corporate interests the justification to proceed aggressively. For years, lobbyists have circulated model legislation, drafted regulatory rollbacks, and mapped out strategies to dismantle standards in sectors such as finance, energy, pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, and labor. The shift in political authority now transforms these plans from proposals into imminent policy trajectories. Financial markets have responded predictably. Investors interpret political consolidation aligned with deregulation as a green light for higher profit margins, reduced compliance costs, and increased operational latitude. Market surges following the victory are not reactions to improved economic fundamentals, but anticipatory movements grounded in the expectation that oversight will weaken and capital expansion will accelerate. Regulatory agencies that once maintained at least moderate independence face mounting pressure to shift priorities, scale back enforcement actions, and interpret statutory authority more narrowly. These institutional shifts, though subtle in public view, have substantial impacts on everything from environmental protections to consumer safety to antitrust enforcement. Simultaneously, corporations are mobilizing rapid response teams to capitalize on the moment. Legal departments, policy advisors, and industry associations are coordinating with sympathetic legislators to draft implementation, ready proposals that can be introduced with minimal delay. The goal is to reshape the regulatory ecosystem before public scrutiny or organized resistance can solidify. These actors understand that windows of political alignment are rare, and they intend to use this period to enact lasting structural changes that extend well beyond the electoral cycle. The momentum is not merely political, it is economic strategy executed through the political arena, with deregulation serving as the primary tool for consolidating corporate power. The consequences of this realignment are being felt most acutely in the realm of labor. The second keynote reveals the other side of the political shift: the growing alarm among workers, unions, and labor advocates who now face a heightened threat to existing protections and bargaining power. The political victory has emboldened efforts to weaken regulatory frameworks that guard against wage theft, unsafe workplaces, exploitative scheduling, and discrimination. These protections, often secured through decades of labor struggle, are at risk of being reframed as obstacles to competitiveness and investment. Policymakers aligned with corporate interests frequently invoke the language of flexibility and modernization to justify reforms that dilute labor standards and erode worker rights. Collective bargaining is particularly vulnerable in this new environment. Sector-wide strategies are emerging to restrict union organizing, expand right to work statutes, and redefine the classification of employees in ways that limit eligibility for benefits and union representation. Gig economy lobbying groups, franchising associations, and large employers in retail, logistics, and tech have intensified their campaigns to restructure labor law in ways that shift power decisively toward management. These moves are supported by policy briefs that portray existing labor protections as outdated relics, unsuited for a dynamic marketplace, while ignoring the real objective, reducing labor's leverage to negotiate wages, benefits, and working conditions. Labor departments and oversight agencies, already under strain from limited funding and political pressure, may now face further weakening. Reduced budgets, narrowed enforcement mandates, and leadership appointments drawn from industry ranks create an environment where labor violations are less likely to be penalized and more likely to be normalized as cost-saving practices. This shift encourages employers to adopt more aggressive labor strategies, knowing that accountability mechanisms are eroding. As labor enforcement declines, the burden of challenging exploitation shifts onto workers themselves, often the individuals least equipped to navigate legal systems or absorb the financial risk of retaliation. The realignment also affects public narratives around labor. Media outlets and political figures aligned with corporate interests have begun reframing labor demands as economically destructive, portraying regulatory rollbacks as necessary sacrifices for national competitiveness. This rhetorical shift is part of a broader strategy to undermine public sympathy for workers' struggles and to isolate labor organizations from broader coalitions. It also serves to redirect attention away from the structural forces that suppress wages and concentrate wealth among corporate shareholders and executives. The intersection of deregulation efforts and labor vulnerability creates a feedback loop. As corporate power expands through weakened oversight and increased capital mobility, labor becomes further marginalized, reducing its ability to counteract policies that favor capital. With each successive deregulation measure, corporations gain leverage to restructure workplaces, redefine employment categories, and set wage standards more aggressively in their favor. This deepens inequality and shifts the balance of economic power even further away from workers. The political victory at the center of these keynotes is thus not merely a partisan triumph, but a catalyst for structural transformation. Corporate advocates are seizing the moment to accelerate long-term objectives that reshape the regulatory and labor landscape in ways that will endure well beyond the current political cycle. Workers, meanwhile, face an intensifying struggle to defend existing protections and maintain a foothold in an economic environment increasingly shaped by interests committed to reducing their power. Wealth concentration accelerates as policy direction tilts toward corporate tax privileges, populist narrative, corporate outcome, political messaging masks, structural economic gains for the few. The political shift that has just unfolded is already reshaping the contours of economic policy in ways that accelerate wealth concentration and reinforce long-standing advantages for corporate power. The new policy direction emerging in the aftermath of the victory signals a renewed commitment to tax structures that disproportionately benefit high-income individuals, major investors, and multinational firms. These measures, framed publicly as incentives for growth and competitiveness, function in practice as mechanisms for expanding capital accumulation at the top of the economic hierarchy. With political momentum behind them, proposals for corporate tax reductions, capital gains relief, and expanded loopholes for investment vehicles are resurfacing at a pace not seen in years, accompanied by economic forecasts that selectively highlight potential growth while ignoring distributional consequences. Corporate advisors and financial strategists are already positioning themselves to take advantage of the anticipated changes. Wealth management firms are circulating internal guidance documents outlining expected policy adjustments, from depreciation allowances to offshore income repatriation incentives. These signals indicate that the largest beneficiaries of the new direction will be sectors with the greatest ability to exploit tax engineering, technology giants, financial conglomerates, real estate investors, and multinational corporations with complex international portfolios. As these actors restructure their assets to maximize the benefits of forthcoming privileges, the gap between capital income and labor income is projected to widen even further. The political victory has thus created an environment in which wealth concentration is not an unintended outcome, but an embedded feature of the policy trajectory. Compounding the shift is the strategic narrative being deployed to justify the changes. Supporters frame tax privileges as essential tools for job creation, innovation, and economic expansion. Yet economic research consistently shows that tax cuts concentrated at the top tend to accelerate asset inflation, rather than stimulate broad-based growth. The surge in stock buybacks, dividend distributions, and executive compensation that historically follows such policy changes underscores how capital owners convert political wins into private financial gains. With regulatory scrutiny expected to decline and fiscal policy increasingly oriented toward corporate interests, wealth inequality is set to deepen, affecting not only income distribution, but also access to housing, healthcare, and education as market forces overwhelm public investment. The second keynote reveals how the political messaging surrounding the victory has played a crucial role in enabling these outcomes. The populist narrative that framed the political campaign emphasized frustration with economic stagnation, declining living standards, and institutional dysfunction. It appealed to voters who have experienced decades of wage stagnation, precarious employment, and rising household debt. Yet the resulting policy proposals are overwhelmingly structured to benefit the very corporate interests that have driven these conditions. This contradiction between rhetoric and outcome is not new, but the current political moment amplifies it with greater clarity and speed. by channeling public anger toward symbolic cultural or political adversaries rather than toward the structural mechanisms of wealth extraction. The political messaging creates a buffer that shields corporate actors from scrutiny. Supporters interpret the victory as a mandate for reform, even as the substance of reform redirects benefits upward. The populist framing provides political cover for measures that would otherwise face significant opposition. Policies that shift tax burdens downward, weaken corporate accountability, and reduce funding for public services relied upon by working and middle-class communities. Corporate lobbying networks have played a central role in shaping this dynamic. These networks supply the economic language, data models, and policy blueprints that align corporate interests with populist sentiment, producing narratives in which deregulation and tax relief are positioned as solutions to ordinary people's struggles. The result is a political environment in which policies that consolidate wealth among elites are presented as victories for the working population. This inversion of economic reality is sustained through media amplification, donor-backed research institutions, and political communication teams skilled at reframing corporate priorities as national imperatives. Meanwhile, the lived economic conditions of most citizens show little sign of improving under these policy trajectories. Rising consumer prices, unstable housing markets, and limited access to affordable health care persist as structural challenges. Yet the policy direction emerging from the political victory centers on expanding privileges for capital rather than addressing the needs of workers. The disjunction between political messaging and economic outcomes grows more pronounced as wealth continues to accumulate among those best positioned to leverage complex financial instruments, global supply chains, and favorable tax structures. What is unfolding is a familiar pattern in which a populist campaign narrative ultimately produces an economic agenda that accelerates inequality. The political victory becomes a gateway through which corporate interests reassert dominance over fiscal and regulatory policy. Public grievances, though real and justified, are absorbed into a political strategy that uses them to advance outcomes contrary to their origins. Corporate tax privileges expand, wealth concentration intensifies, and the structural forces driving inequality become even more deeply entrenched within the economic system. Financial sector reacts. Capital markets position for profit as oversight signals weaken, public discontent redirected. Political victory reinforces long-term strategy of economic misdirection. The political win has triggered an immediate shift in financial strategy, with major institutions repositioning assets in anticipation of weakened oversight and expanded profit latitude. Market actors interpret the new climate as an opportunity to accelerate high-risk investment, lobby for softer compliance rules, and expand influence over policy execution. As capital prepares to capitalize on reduced scrutiny, public frustration is simultaneously being redirected through intensified political messaging. Economic grievances are reframed toward cultural targets rather than the corporate structures driving inequality, allowing financial sectors to advance their agenda with minimal resistance. Inequality forecast rises. Policy shifts expected to widen gap between profits and wages. Systemic dynamics unmasked. Major win reveals enduring alliance between political authority and capital power following the political shift. Economic analysts warn that new policy directions will accelerate the divide between corporate profits and stagnant wages. Early signals point to reduced labor protections and expanded incentives for capital owners, heightening structural inequality. At the same time, the victory exposes how political authority continues to align with concentrated economic power, revealing a system in which policy outcomes consistently reinforce the interests of those controlling capital. When we assemble every part of this story from beginning to end, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. A major political win served as the spark, but the explosion was economic. Overnight, the forces of capital seized the moment, pushing deregulation, securing tax structures that favor the wealthiest, tightening their grip on policy, and weakening the protections meant for workers. Financial institutions prepared for profit, while public anger was carefully redirected away from the true architects of inequality. The gap between wages and profits widens, markets celebrate, and the system's loyalties become unmistakable. What we witnessed is not a random outcome. It is the predictable function of an economic structure built to elevate capital and sideline labor. This entire chain of events, every shift, every reaction, every policy nudge, reveals the enduring alliance between those who hold political authority and those who command economic power. And this alliance shapes the lives of millions far more than any election soundbite ever will. That is why USA World Reports is here, to break down the story behind the story, to reveal the economics driving the politics, and to give the public the full picture that others prefer to keep hidden.